Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. Tonight we continue on with our series, A Journey to Faith. Tonight's lesson is lesson 81 and it's called The Four Kingdoms of Daniel's Vision. So I'm going to recap a little bit on last week, but we're going to start off with the introduction material first, just to give you a bit of background. First of all, the purpose of what we're following is we're following the genealogy of Jesus from the time of Abraham all the way through to the time of Jesus. So this, of course, is found in the first chapter of Matthew in the New Testament, and we're looking at the portion from verses 12 to 17 after the exile to Babylon. Now, in previous weeks, for the 4 previous weeks, we've been looking at this descendant Zadok, who's 7 generations before Jesus. And tonight, for the first time, we go to Akim, who is 6 generations before Jesus. So we're narrowing the gap. We've been travelling this journey from 2,000 years before Jesus, and we're just on the cusp of entering into the 200s rather than the 300 BCs. Now, during the time of Akim, we've got his date averages because there's no specific information about this. We've estimated that he's born somewhere around 314 BC and that he will pass away somewhere around 255 BC based on the average age when we divide the known times of the kings from the known times of Jesus. We end up with an age average of 59 years. Now, during the rule of Akim, we only have the Greek Empire now. We've passed the time of the Persians. And during the time of Akim, you can see these 2 colours here. We've got 2 rulers who influence the province of Judea. One of them is Ptolemy I, and the other one, in fact, is Ptolemy II. And there's some jostling around between other kingdoms as they come and go. So we'll explain that as we travel. Once again, it's now a province of the Greek Empire, and this is the province itself by these boundaries. Not the full boundary of Israel, no northern component of Israel, and importantly, because this has a big effect on what happens in history, the corridor down the coast is actually not occupied by the Jewish people whatsoever. Now, just to recap on where we were up to, this map shows this whole region. So up on the top left here, we've got Thracia, and we've got Macedonia, and then we've got the Greek peninsula down here, the Peloponnese, and we've got the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Crete itself. So all those regions are controlled by the Greeks under a ruler by the name of Cassander, who's in these territories here, and Thrace is under the rule of this fellow called Lysimachus. Now, Asia Minor hasn't yet separated as a separate entity, but this fellow called Antagonian Monothelmus or Monothelus, which means one eye. He is appointed the supreme commander of the Macedonian forces in this region of Asia Minor, and he has eyes set on being a ruler of the whole empire. And this is the point, all of the generals that came after Alexander the Great, they all had a design that they would be the next emperor of all of the states. Over here in the yellow, we've got this region which is controlled by Ptolemy, who is aligned very much with the Greeks. So we find in history that the Greeks, from where they originally come from, I should say, and the Egyptian nations, they've been working together against the influences that come across from the east. And so we see at this point in time that the province of Judea is firmly controlled by the Ptolemy rule. We'll explain a bit more on that tonight. And then this pink area here represents an area which is basically going to be divided into 2 components, and we're going to talk about that tonight. So the prophecy that is given in the explanation for Daniel, it tells how at first there will be 3 components and then it will break into 4, and that will represent the 4 kingdoms that was revealed to him. So we're going to look into this as we travel on tonight. So I'll just check what the next map. So I'll leave this map up behind us, and I'll explain this as we travel along. So once again, the scriptures which reveal Akim to us is found in the book of Matthew, and it simply says in Matthew 1 verse 14, Zadok, the father of Akim, and that's the only mention of his name in the Bible. We can blow that off as being insignificant, but of course he's a forefather of Jesus. In order for Jesus the Messiah to come, Akim had to live a full life and also give birth to the next generation. And so God had a plan for him and a role for him, and so we explore what life looked like during his lifetime. As mentioned, we've estimated he's born in 314 BC, and he's the only descendant in the genealogy of Jesus who was actually originally born under the rule of the Macedonian Empire when Alexander the Great completely conquered the whole region, and he's the first to come under the control of Antagonius, who is going to rule this region up here. So I just mentioned it's going to split into 4. So this becomes known as the Antagonian Empire. Now, of course, Akim, as we've mentioned, he's not in Jerusalem. His family from the time of Zerubbabel were returned to live in Bethlehem. So the kings before them, of course, lived in Jerusalem, but their inheritance was in Bethlehem. So this is where he resides. So many of the events that happen in Jerusalem don't necessarily affect the smaller rural villages. Now, I'm going to just read a small portion from Daniel to set the scene of the prophetic word that we're actually seeking through history that fulfills what's actually said. So from Daniel chapter 11, and so this is the part of the Bible which gives us the information for which we can align history to. And so we're going to read from chapter 11. Last week we read a little portion. I'm going to read that again, and then I'm going to add on a new portion tonight for what happens. So from verse 2, it reads, Now then I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty, so verse 3, chapter 11 of Daniel, then a mighty king will appear who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. And that was Alexander. So that's Alexander the Great. So the 3 kings are those last 3 kings from Persia, and then Alexander the Great comes along. And going to verse 4, and we looked at this last week, it says, After he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parcelled out towards the 4 winds of heaven. And so what's happening there is after he appeared, an appearance is normally what? A short thing. When you speak of someone's appearance, it's something that explains something that happened on a short period of time. And so we learn from history that Alexander the Great took over when he was 20 years old as the king of Macedon after his father. And by the age of 32, he had conquered what was the known empire, the Greek Empire as it's called, but it's really the Macedonian Empire. But he was someone who was short-lived, and he passed away at 32. And so history is revealing to us that none of his descendants will actually rule, and this is part of what we're exploring. So when it says here that his empire will be broken up and parcelled out towards the 4 winds of heaven, it continues and says, it will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. And so long before it happened, a couple of 100 years before this happened, the prophecy that we're reading about here, which is given through the book of Daniel, but through the angel, is actually telling us that this empire is going to break up into 4 components, and none of the descendants of Alexander the Great will ever rule. Now in verse 5, it says, the king of the south will become strong, And so the king of the south is Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic Empire. But one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. So someone who is actually with him is in fact Seleucus. Here's his picture here. His name is Seleucus Nicator. I'll explain these second names a bit later. But you can see the size of his empire becomes the largest region of all. And so he is somebody who was formerly with Ptolemy. And so we'll explain how that happens again tonight. But what we can see when we look at history, and this is the whole point, is that all of the words that come from the Lord are fulfilled. And so whilst it's historical, we're actually, I guess, proving through earthly means the truth of the Bible and what God says. So it's not just some fairy tale or some story as people say. It is truth and history enacted what was prophesied long before it occurred. And so these four kingdoms, as we're talking about, here they are on the board, and we'll explain what happens. We've got the Seleucid Empire. It says the four winds, so it's talking about four empires, and the four winds are representative of four compass directions. And so here to the east, we have the Seleucid Empire. Here to the south, we have the Ptolemaic Empire. To the north, we have the Antagonian Empire. And to the west, we have these two kingdoms, the kingdom of Thrace and the kingdom of Macedonia. We'll address this. This actually changes and expands and comes across here a bit later. But this is the fourth region to the west over here. And so this is what we're going to look at tonight. I'm not going to go any further into verse 6 because verse 6 comes later. It's something that we're going to look at in another lesson. If you read it, it's extraordinary because it's very detailed. It talks about the daughter of a king, and it talks about alliances and retaining power and all these things that happen, but it doesn't put any names to it. And yet when we explore history, we find exactly these things occur. Okay, so that's the premise for tonight's lesson. Tonight in the second half, we're going to be looking at a lot of biblical content, and in the first half, we're going to be looking at a lot of historical content. So here we go. So Antigonus, who again we've mentioned is ruling or governing over this region in Asia Minor, he had set siege to a coastal fortress city of Tyre in the summer of 315 BC. So on the map here is Tyre. Tyre is in today's Lebanon. It's a strong point. It's always been a strong coastal port. It was formerly an island. Alexander the Great built a wall out to it and made it part of the mainland. But it is a stronghold and it is a seafaring nation that was there. And so it's always something which controls the waters in this region. And so this is the location here. So he set siege to the coastal fortress city of Tyre in 315 BC. Why? Because it had been taken by the Egyptians. We mentioned this on the previous week. When he first invaded Syria, but it took a year and 3 months to conquer by starving Ptolemy's soldiers into submission. Whilst Antigonus was occupied with Tyre, Seleucus, who doesn't occupy this territory yet but is under the rule of Ptolemy, helping him, he took the opportunity to sail Ptolemy's naval fleet to Cyprus, which is on the map here. So at this point in time, we've got Cyprus being contained by the opposite party. So successfully reconquering this strategically located island, Cyprus was made an Egyptian possession. So on the map you can see it's coloured pink because it was formerly part of the Antagonian area that was being controlled. And so we see here this arrow going up because they sailed up to have this battle and they came down by land to have this battle. So Ptolemy was superior in water, but Antigonus definitely had the upper hand on land. So it became imperative for Ptolemy to expand his land army, whilst Antigonus set about building his navy. A peace settled between them until 312 BC, and Ptolemy used his large fleet of naval vessels to attack the province of Cilicia. And so this is up here. Okay, so these generals, these former generals, they're all battling against one another to have greater control. Ptolemy then led an army across the Sinai Peninsula with Seleucus as his commander to invade the province of Syria from the south. And so this is this arrow here. They were heading up to go to Syria to push back what was being controlled by Antigonus. But when Ptolemy arrived at the coastal border in Gaza, he was intercepted by a fellow called Demetrius, who is the son of Antigonus. And he was assisted by a governor from Babylonia, and he was also assisted by a former admiral of King Alexander the Great called Nearchus. Now Ptolemy and his commander Seleucus had arrived with 18,000 infantrymen and 4,000 cavalry, whereas Demetrius intercepted them with 12,500 infantry, 4,400 cavalry, and 43 war elephants. So his army was much larger. And of course, even though they were actually heading to go up to here, they never made it, because where were they intercepted? Down here in Gaza. And so what became known as the Battle of Gaza, Ptolemy's forces actually won, and with 500 men dead, 8,000 men captured, and all of his war elephants killed, Demetrius retreated to Tripolis on the former Phoenician coast. So Ptolemy then followed him north up the coastal plain towards Syria. So we find that even though Antigonus had formerly had more power on land, they actually came up here and they won this battle. So the shift of power. Now, mentioning in all of this, because it's in the region, the province of Judea was between the territories that's held between these two countries that are warring against each other, or two regions. And whilst they travelled along the coastal plains, there was no strategic advantage, because they were just fighting for territory, to actually go to Jerusalem or into Judea itself. And so what happened during this time is that the people of Judea were able to remain free from the conflicts. Now, when Ptolemy marched his army up the east Mediterranean coast to Syria, Antigonus arrived, and although Ptolemy had built up his army and routed his son, he turned around and headed home on the understanding he was still no match for the supreme commander of Asia. And so he basically kept going, and then decided when this next army was coming down, it was too much. So he headed back home again. This has an outcome to it for doing this, though, because on this occasion Ptolemy's attempt to recapture Syria had been thwarted, but his commander Seleucus, who was the former governor of Babylonia, he took the opportunity to separate his army units from those retreating with Ptolemy, and he went eastward. So this is the beginning of the formation of all of this, okay, because his leader turned home. And so he said, I'm not having a bar of that, I'm going to leave. And so he decided it was time to cross the desert and march to Babylon to reclaim his right to rule over Babylonia, because he was a former governor of Babylonia living here in Babylon, which we spoke about last week. So again, apologies, very historical, but you can sort of see that these battles are going on in this region, and Seleucus comes and separates himself to go out here to the east. So as nothing else, it became clear that the struggle between the Diadochi, which means the successors, was not going to be resolved in the immediate future. So Antigonus established a peace treaty with Ptolemy, Lysimachus and Cassander, who are up here in these regions. So all of these people, they all formed a treaty between one another, and the war ended. And although Ptolemy and Antigonus disagreed over Syria, they agreed to cease fighting. And so this is where we go, as I do, into the history books, and we go to a historian called Diodorus of Sicily, who we mentioned before last week, and he describes these events in the 19th volume of his book Bibliotheca Historia, which in English means the Library of World History. And it reads, at Athens, Cassander, Ptolemy and Lysimachus put an end to the war against Antigonus and concluded a treaty. It was specified in it that Cassander should be general of Europe, until Alexander, Roxanne's son, should come of age, because Alexander had a baby boy that was born after he died, and that baby boy is still alive. Roxanne is his mother. His brother was killed last week. He had a brother, Alexander, who they executed on the previous week. So Europe, so just keep this in mind, when they talk about Europe, that is this side of this body of water that passes through to the Black Sea. And so this is the Dardanelles, or where Gallipoli was fought on here. So everything on that side is Europe when you speak in history, and everything on this side in history is known as Asia. And so this Asian region here is known as Asia Minor. Today we don't really think of it as Asia, but in those days that's how it was termed. So reading on, it reads, so Roxanne's age, so it would specify that Cassander would be general of Europe until Alexander, Roxanne's son, or the son of Alexander the Great, should come of age, that Lysimachus should be master of Thrace and Ptolemy master of Egypt, and the neighbouring cities in Libya and Arabia, that Antigonus should command the whole of Asia, while the Greeks should be autonomous. So when it says Antigonus should command the whole of Asia, what does that mean? It means all of this territory here. So at this point in time, that's what the treaty said, because Seleucus was not ruling anything at that point in time. So Cassander saw that Roxanne's son Alexander was growing up, and that there were some who were spreading the word in Macedonia that one ought to release the boy from custody and hand over him to his father's kingdom. Afraid for his own safety, he instructed Glaucius, who was in charge of the boy's custody, to assassinate his mother Roxanne and the king and conceal their bodies, and not to report the deed to any of the others. Glaucius carried out the orders, and this freed Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and even Antigonus from anticipated fears about the king. And so at this point in time, Alexander the Great's son was killed, as simple as that. And so now, what does that mean for us? The word of the Lord given to the archangel Gabriel to the prophet Daniel said that the power to rule the Macedonian Empire, Daniel 11:4, which we just read, will not go to his descendants. Whose descendants? Alexander the Great. The prophecy had once again been fulfilled through this point of history. Alexander IV of Macedon, as his son was known, was killed in 311 BC, and the empire of King Alexander the Great, as it also says in Daniel 11:4, was uprooted and given to others. So these are all the generals that we're talking about with these names. So in essence, this is the end of the royal Macedonian family. So we're going to read on to see what happens. The historian, one of the last notes he said was that for now that there was no one to take over the empire, those who ruled peoples or cities could each entertain hopes of kingship, which is what they always wanted, and controlled henceforward the territory under their power, like kingdoms that had been conquered in war. And so what we're seeing is each of these regions are no longer areas that are governed under a fractured empire. They're in fact now looking to be separate kingdoms with separate rulers. And of course, what does that mean? They're all going to fight against one another, and that's what we're starting to see happen. So in 316 BC, when Antigonus swept through the eastern provinces of the Macedonian Empire, Seleucus had fled from Babylonia to Ptolemy in Egypt. So this is just going back to what happened last week. Antigonus replaced him with Pithon, the former governor of Gandhara in India, but in 312 BC he was killed in the Battle of Gaza that we just spoke about. So this meant as Seleucus and his men marched eastwards, there was no governor in Babylon to overcome on his arrival in May 311 BC. Again, these events are told by Diodorus of Sicily in the 19th volume of his book, Bibliotheca Historia. So we'll read this portion. And it reads, in Asia, after the defeat of Demetrius at Gaza in Syria, Seleucus, receiving from Ptolemy no more than 800 foot soldiers and about 200 horse, set out for Babylon. He was so puffed up with great expectations that even if he had no army whatsoever, he would have made the expedition into the interior with his friends and his own slaves. For he assumed that the Babylonians, on account of the goodwill that had previously existed, would promptly join him, and that Antigonus, by withdrawing to a great distance with his army, had given him a suitable opportunity for his own enterprises. So he's seeking to no longer be a subordinate governor. He now wants to rule his own region as a king, and so this is what's starting to happen. While such was his own enthusiasm, those of his friends who accompanied him were no little disheartened when they saw that the men who were making the campaign with them were very few. When in his advance he entered Mesopotamia, he persuaded some of the Macedonians who were settled at a place called Carrhae to join his forces and compel the rest. When he pushed into Babylonia, most of the inhabitants came to meet him, and declaring themselves on his side, promised to aid him as he saw fit. For when he had been for 4 years governor of that country, he had shown himself generous to all, winning the goodwill of the common people. So in other words, when he used to rule there, before he fled to Egypt because the Antigonus was coming across, he had been a well-loved ruler. And so when he went back, people welcomed him back with open arms. So it says, he was joined also by a fellow called Polyarchus, who had been placed in command of a certain district with more than 1,000 soldiers. When those who remained loyal to Antigonus saw that the impulse of the people could not be checked, they took refuge together in the citadel of which Decapolis had been appointed commander. But Seleucus, by laying siege to the citadel and taking it by storm, recovered the persons of all those of his friends and slaves who had been placed there under guard by the order of Antigonus. When he had finished this, he enlisted soldiers, and having brought up horses, he distributed them to those who were able to handle them. Associating with all on friendly terms and raising high hopes in all, he kept his fellow adventurers ready and eager under every condition. In this way, then, Seleucus regained Babylonia. But when Nicanor, the general in Media, gathered against him from Media and Persia and the neighbouring lands, more than 10,000 foot soldiers and 7,000 horse, Seleucus set out at full speed to oppose the enemy. He himself had in all more than 3,000 foot and 400 horse, so he'd grown in size. He crossed the Tigris River, and on hearing that the enemy were a few days' march distant, he hid his soldiers in the marshes, intending to make his attack a surprise. When Nicanor arrived at the Tigris and did not find the enemy, he camped at one of the royal stations, believing that they had fled to a greater distance than was the case. When night was come and the army of Nicanor was keeping a perfunctory and negligent guard, Seleucus fell on them suddenly, causing great confusion and panic. When this occurred, most of the soldiers went over to Seleucus, in part because they were frightened at the danger, but in part because they were offended by the conduct of Antigonus, so they didn't like the ruler Antigonus. So Nicanor, who was left with only a few men and feared lest he be delivered over to the enemy, took flight with his friends through the desert. But Seleucus, now that he had gained control of a large army and was comporting himself in a way gracious to all, easily won over Elam, Media, and some of the adjacent lands, and he wrote to Ptolemy and his other friends about his achievements, already possessing a king's stature and a reputation worthy of royal power. So he very quickly grew. So he went over here to Babylon. He ended up taking over all of Babylonia, and then it says he took Media, this region up here, Elam, which is this region down here, and what was the other one? And some of the adjacent lands. So basically it means he went from being here to, I guess, pushing across to here somewhere. So he took a territory which was so big now that it's almost equivalent to the territories of these other people, and so he started to feel he was worthy of being a king as well. So Seleucus was recognised as the governor of Babylonia on the 1st of June in 311 BC. So Antigonus sent his forces there, starting what was known as the Babylonian War. As the next half year progressed, Seleucus became more powerful, and Antigonus was unable to regain control of the empire's eastern territories. So in August 310, he went to the city of Babylon himself. Antagonian was still unsuccessful by March 309 BC, so he left the city to continue fighting in the country, but in a full-scale battle late in August, Seleucus forced Antagonian to retreat to Syria. Antagonian had lost the east, and while Seleucus went further to conquer Bactria and invade India, Antagonian focused on the west. And so Bactria is this region up here behind his face, and this is the region of India. I mentioned this before, this is Pakistan, this is India as we know it today, but in those days India was one nation. I think it was 1948 that Pakistan separated from India. One was known as Pakistan. India to this day is actually known as Hindustan. Okay, so they were one nation, and so you can see this purple region that crosses into what was formerly called India. And so now, suddenly, this fellow has conquered all of this in a matter of a few years and pushed back who was meant to be controlling all of this region, which is Antagonian. And so we see the presence of a fourth party now fulfilling the prophecy. Now, victorious in all he did, Seleucus was given the title Nicator. And this is the word up the top here, Nicator. I'd ask the question, but no one will probably know what it means. But based on the fact that he had all these victories, Nicator means victor. So his name means Seleucus, the victorious in essence. And so that was his name and how it's remembered in history. Now, forced to focus on the west, because he's lost the east now, Antagonian decided to plan against Cassander of Macedonia and Heracles, who was an illegitimate son of Alexander the Great, with his mother Barsine. So what we find is that Alexander had other children, but they weren't born as a royal member, a legitimate son. So a bit of names here again. So King Alexander, so the illegitimate son of King Alexander the Great, with his mother Barsine, to the deposed regent Polyperchon, who was still in the Peloponnese. So this is mountains here. Now Polyperchon was actually the son of Antipater, and Antipater bypassed his son and gave the rule of this region to this fellow called Cassander. We spoke about this last week. But basically you can see in this region it's still in conflict. So it was thought that this fellow Polyperchon could use them to raise support against Cassander, but this backfired when Cassander convinced Polyperchon to side with him. So this fellow Heracles was killed, and yet again the word of the Lord given by the archangel Gabriel to the prophet Daniel was fulfilled. Even though Heracles was not part of the Macedonian royal family, as a descendant of King Alexander the Great, meaning an illegitimate descendant, the power to rule the Macedonian Empire, as Daniel 11:4 says, did not go to his descendants. So even the point of this is the illegitimate son who was brought into this contest for this region, he too was killed. So we find that the prophecy is absolute. It doesn't matter whether they're legitimate, illegitimate, brothers, sons. All this history is telling us that each and every one of them, step by step by step, was actually killed and taken out of play. Okay. So Ptolemy, back down here in the south, sorry, it's hard to explain all these years of history, so trying to keep it brief. He landed at Corinth on the narrow neck of land that connected the southern Peloponnese. So Corinth is actually right here. Corinth, of course, is the book of Corinthians that we know in the Bible that Paul went to. So this is this region just over here on the map. So Ptolemy went up there and he landed there, and he'd been making financial contributions to Cassander. I said earlier that they had formed an alliance, and he declared that he supported free and autonomous Greek towns, but because his support was conditional on his financial contributions, he'd made a hypocrite of himself and caused Cassander offence. So in other words, he went there and declared to everybody what he'd been doing, whereas all those people prior to that thought that the money had been coming from Cassander. So if you and I make an alliance, I'm the ruler of my country and I hand out to my people. But the person who was sending him the money, Ptolemy, actually went there and said, you're all free, I'm the one who's actually been giving you money, so what does the ruler Cassander think? Well, this is not on, this guy's a hypocrite, he shouldn't have done this. So he undermined him. So understanding he'd made a poor move, he decided to leave Europe and he went back to Egypt in 308 BC. So we're getting close to 300 BC now. It was at the same time that the army of Antagonius had arrived in Syria after its defeat at the hands of Seleucus. So Antagonius had come to show a sign of his strength, and humiliated from his defeat, he still had a powerful and dangerous army. Perhaps not a good time for Ptolemy to be in the region. So Ptolemy basically backed out, came back from there and returned to his region. Okay, so in 307 BC, Antagonius again, from this region, he began a fourth war, which is called the Fourth Diadoch War. And he sent his son Demetrius to Greece to bring a confederation of island states in the Aegean, known as the Nesiotic League, under his control. Successful in his endeavour, he then landed in Athens, and although unexpected, Demetrius proclaimed the Athenians were free to restore their laws and their ancestral constitution, and expelled the garrisons. And Demetrius of a place called Phaleron, the governor appointed by Cassander. The Athenians not only declared Demetrius a liberator and a god, but responded in a practical way and immediately began rebuilding the navy to support Antagonius. And so what we basically see is in this Greek region, it's a very brittle alliance. Every time someone comes and offers them money or comes and says we'll support you, they seem to flip and flop and change sides, and they also break their previous alliances that they had formed before then. So up until this time, Greece had been under the influence of Cassander with Ptolemy's support, but now the Athenians had regained their own democracy. Cassander lost his control of Greece. Remember I mentioned that there's two regions here. There's this down here, Greece down here. There's Macedonia here, and there's also Thrace. So there's actually three regions, so it's the lower region that was lost. But now the Athenians had regained their own democracy. Cassander lost his control of Greece. Right. So the Greek author and philosopher Plutarch, who some of you may have heard of, in his book called A Life of Demetrius, described how Antagonius and his son were the first successors to be given the title of kings. So this is part of the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, because suddenly when we get to verse 5 in Daniel 11, they're no longer people who are governors or rulers, in that sense of the word. They start getting called kings. And so this is the first to happen. So it reads, "For they were the first who gave him and his father Antigonus the title of kings, which they had hitherto religiously avoided, and which was indeed the only thing left the descendants of Philippus and Alexander uninvaded by their generals. In the next place they alone honoured them with the appellation of the gods' protectors, and instead of naming the year as formerly from the Archon, they abolished his office, created annually in his place a priest of those gods' protectors, and prefixed his name to all their public acts." Sounds complicated, but basically the Greeks had gods. When Alexander the Great set everything up, there was certain Hellenization, so in other words, culture that went through the different regions. They were obliged to observe particular gods. But you see here that when they become king, all of the pantheon was being changed. And so we see here, they call him, this person as a king, they call him God's protectors. So in other words, the kings are people who protect the gods as they saw them in their pantheons. Okay. So going to 306 BC, Demetrius then invaded Cyprus, which was defended by the brother of Ptolemy. He was defeated when his brother came to his aid and suffered a naval defeat. The strategically positioned island of Cyprus was lost. So thanks to his son Demetrius and the victories he wrought over the other successors, Antagonius was again recognised as the most powerful Greek ruler. And so we said a bit earlier that Ptolemy had gone up here and won a battle. Now he's come back and he's taken it back. So they're to and fro on this island. Antagonius was recognised once again. And when news reached him in his new Syrian capital, Antagonia, he accepted the royal title given to him by the Athenians and sent a crown to his son. So in other words, he sees himself now as a king. So we're going to change maps. Same map. A couple of pictures for you. This is a coin which was minted contemporary to the time and this is Ptolemy the First Soter. I'm going to explain what that name means in a moment. And so this is what the first ruler of this empire looked like. This coin, we saw a bust of Seleucus, who was taking over this region, but this is a coin that was minted for the Seleucid ruler. So these are a couple of coins I was able to access for showing how they looked. In this map here, this explains how Cassander was pushed out of the Peloponnese and Athens down here, which we just mentioned in 306 BC, and Cyprus was taken back by Demetrius, the son of Antigonus, also in the same year. So Ptolemy, and this is the whole point of this again from our point of view, Ptolemy of Egypt, Seleucus of Babylonia, Lysimachus of Thrace heard the news, and with every descendant of King Alexander the Great dead, what did they do? They all said, I'm a king too. And so they all took on the title of kings. Apparently Cassander initially refused to take this title, but he changed his mind and became the first king of Macedonia since the death of Alexander IV, the son of Alexander the Great. So going back to the Bible again, it says, after the archangel Gabriel gave the prophet Daniel the word of the Lord that said the empire of King Alexander the Great will be given to others, in Daniel 11:4, he then began to call the Diadochi, or the new successors, by the title of king. And that's what we see in Daniel chapter 11 verse 5 all the way through to verse 45. So we're just at the beginning of that journey, but all the way through the rest of this chapter they're now known as kings. So this fulfills the earlier vision of Daniel, in which he saw the large horn of the goat broken off to be replaced by 4 prominent horns, Daniel 8 verse 8, that the archangel Gabriel said represented in Daniel 8 verse 22 4 kingdoms. So in order to have kingdoms, you have to have a king ruling it. So these words that have been used in the past, we see them now all being fulfilled in this somewhat complicated history. Now at this time there are 5 new kingdoms formed. Why? Because Macedonia and Thrace up here are still separate at this point in time. Okay. But they say that the 4 most prominent who became kings of the first kingdoms ruled Macedonia, Antagonian Empire, the Seleucid Empire, and the Ptolemaic Empire. So Macedonia, Antagonian Empire, Ptolemaic Empire, and the Seleucid Empire. 4 kingdoms. Okay, the last portion of historical, and then we're going to get into some more of the biblical stuff. So after being defeated in this naval battle, the Ptolemaic Empire had lost its entire navy and were defenceless by sea. The newly titled King Antigonus, who now ruled Asia Minor, Syria, the island of Cyprus, and the Nisotic League of island states in the Aegean Sea, saw an opportunity to attack Egypt. In the summer of 306 BC, he marched a large army southwards past the sub-province of Judea, whilst his son Demetrius commanded his naval fleet and carried necessary supplies. King Antigonus planned his first attack to come by sea, but storms prevented the navy from approaching Egypt, and without supplies he could not feed his army. Forced to return, the newly titled Pharaoh, because that's the name of a king in Egypt, had a reprieve. So after his return, Antigonus decided to go west again and attack the newly titled King Cassander of Macedon, who was trying to restore order in Greece after the previous visit of his son Demetrius. And so we see, if you take notice of what's happening, Antigonus here, he's the one that's constantly going out trying to increase his empire. You see that it's generally not the others. Ptolemy went up once, but most of the time we find this guy is the guy who's trying to push the boundaries. So the island of Rhodes kept a large navy that controlled the entrance to the Aegean Sea, and a mercantile city-state. It not only traded commercially, but had the capacity to help Pharaoh Ptolemy to rebuild his navy. So for this reason, Antigonus sent his son to Rhodes to start a siege in 305 BC, but reinforced by Cassander, the newly titled king of Thrace, and also the Pharaoh Ptolemy, the relatively small siege turned into one of the major battles fought in the Fourth War. So that's the Diadoch War, as they're all called. Now the siege continued for a year without victory, so a compromise was reached in which the people of Rhodes agreed to support Antigonus against all enemies with the exception of Ptolemy. King Antigonus took this resolved stalemate as a victory, and oddly his son Demetrius was honoured with the name Poliocertes, which means taker of cities, whilst Pharaoh Ptolemy got his name that's remembered in history, and that's this name Soter. I imagine none of you know what Soter means. Soter means, that's it there, S-O-T-E-R, it means saviour. So Soter is a Greek word for saviour, and so this is when he got his name. So that's the historical point. In 304 BC, Cassander then besieged Athens, so Demetrius went to Greece to liberate them. The prince was so successful he continued to liberate other Greek towns and won the support of this region. In 303 BC, the prince brought them together to form a league, which is a collective of mutual protection, and they agreed he should be their commander with the right to conscript men as soldiers. Having lost to Demetrius for a second time, Cassander asked for peace in 302 BC, but both Antigonus and his son believed they could defeat him and demanded an unconditional surrender. Cassander refused, negotiations ended, so Demetrius decided to invade Thessaly further north, and Cassander went to defend this much closer position to Macedonia. But the two armies did not engage in battle, they kept an eye on one another instead. Cassander confronted the ambitions of Antigonus, and his son Demetrius had contacted Ptolemy from Egypt, Lysimachus of Thrace, and Seleucus for the first time appears to be contacted and respected, and they all promised to help. Demetrius had been outplayed, so he bowed to the pressure and decided to make the peace agreement with Cassander. So King Antigonus had always sought to reunify the former Macedonian Empire. So notice how we say he sought to reconnect it back together again. He's going out as the aggressor, so he's saying, I'm doing that because I want to bring you all back together. What's the problem? He wants to bring it back together under his rule. And of course, who does everyone else want to do? They want to bring it back together under their rule. And so they're all got the same outlook. So Lysimachus of Thrace, understanding that Antigonus sought to unite the former empire under his personal rule, decided he needed to support his allies, otherwise he too may find that his territories were under threat. So for this reason, Demetrius, the son of Antigonus, was busy engaged in Cassander. He invaded Asia Minor and captured Sardis and Ephesus on the Ionian coast. So this is these places here. So they're now coming across back and attacking him. This news was a great surprise, and when it reached Demetrius, he crossed the Aegean Sea to march his army from the west, whilst his father marched a second army from the east. And in 302 BC, Lysimachus found himself trapped between two armies. So there's all this toing and froing. At first, Cassander sent reinforcements, but the navy of Demetrius intercepted and stopped them. And then 301, so I'm zooming through year after year, I'm sorry. So we're now in 301 BC. The army of Ptolemy from Egypt marches north past Judea to invade Syria, but he chose to turn back when he received a falsified report saying Antigonus had already won the battle. By this time, however, Antigonus and Demetrius, his son, were ready to attack the army of Thrace, whom they had isolated near a village in Phrygia, which is over, you just can't quite see it, but it's just over here on the map. What they couldn't stop or anticipate, though, was that Seleucus unexpectedly arrived from the east with a large army and 500 war elephants. It's always good, all the rulers who come from the east, they always have elephants because that's where the elephants are. Yeah. So they keep bringing them into the battle. So you can sort of understand the history of use of elephants from these empires. So far away, while all this is happening in the small town of Bethlehem, just south of Jerusalem, the hill country of Judea, Akim had just become a teenager at the age of 13 when this battle of Ipsus took place in Phrygia in Asia Minor. The armies of Antigonus and his son Demetrius were no match for Seleucus, who saved Lysimachus from disaster. That's the European leader from Thrace. Antagonius was killed by a rain of spears and arrows, whilst his son Demetrius escaped with a small force back to Greece in an attempt to preserve a remnant of his rule. And so I'm going to change the map once again, and here's what's happening. So the Seleucid Empire has now grown into all of this region here as well. And so there's the battle for Ipsus, there's Phrygia, and this is the newly contained area of the Seleucid Empire. Now remember the scripture, it said, the king of the south will become strong, Daniel 11 verse 5. But one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. And so what's happening? Here he is, and he is becoming even stronger. In other words, he's got the largest territory by far. Once again, a lot of history, but we see it just continues to fulfill the biblical prophecy as we go along. So as victors, Lysimachus of Thrace and Seleucus, who ruled to the east, now had to divide up the spoils of war, the Antagonian Empire. There was only one problem, and that's that Ptolemy of Egypt already controlled the southern Levant. So the Levant is the eastern Mediterranean, and he's already controlling the southern region here. He already controlled the southern region as a protectorate, a buffer zone to protect his own kingdom. And this happens throughout history. The Egyptians like to control territory outside of Egypt in order that it stops any invading force coming through. So of course this territory included Judea, a territory that was now going to become the subject of a dispute between two powerful kings who had absolutely no interest in unifying the former Macedonian Empire of King Alexander the Great. And so what we see here is that the Jewish people, Akim's one of them, they're now in a region which is potentially under threat. Now in this map, I'll just point out a few things which are marked on here. You can see that when this territory was divided up, the kingdom of Thrace now goes all the way across to here, and so Europe has now come into what was called Asia, and you can see he moves all the way across the top over here. And so his region, if you will, his empire, is bigger than it's ever been in history as a result of this. So King Lysimachus of Thrace extends his territory. Now King Seleucus extends his territory into Asia Minor, as we just mentioned. Lycia here and Cilicia were given to this fellow called Plistarchus, who was the brother of King Cassander of Macedonia. So he's Macedonian. So they must have given these regions as a placatory measure so there's no more conflict from them. And down here, although Pharaoh Ptolemy didn't participate in the Battle of Ipsus and wasn't part of the subdivision of the Antagonian Empire, he took some of the southern territory in the former province of Syria that should have gone to Seleucus. So he was an opportunist to grab a bit more territory. Now, what happened as a result of this, and this is why the mention of Ptolemy is important, is that the province of Syria was divided now into four regions. One is called Syria itself, to the north, this name here. Another is called Coal Syria. This word coal is an explanation of the valley between mountain ranges here, and this name represents that valley. The third one is the area of former Phoenicia, and what was the next one? Palestine. So here we come to a moment in history where we have the name Palestine for the first time. Of course today it's still being used as a term to define that region, isn't it? In fact, the British Army in the First World War described this whole region as Palestine. And so today we talk about Palestinians. People say that this name is a derivative of the Philistines, but it's got nothing whatsoever to do with it. It was actually named by the Greeks. Now when this was named, the region of Palestine encompassed the provinces or the sub-provinces of Samaria and of Judea. Now the name Palestine, the first time it was used was by a Greek historian, you may have heard him, called Herodotus. and he wrote of a district of Syria, and he called it Palestine. It's spelled P-A-L-A-I-S-T-I-N-E, between Phoenicia and Egypt, in his book, The Histories. And so there's documented evidence for the first time that this name was actually used. And so now we're going to go into a lot of biblical information and a lot of references from the Bible. We've got through all this historical content, which fulfills Daniel's prophecy. But let's have a look at what's going on the ground. So Judea was predominantly an agrarian economy, cultivating its land for food, and the city of Jerusalem was its only large city. Its population was divided along the same lines: an urban population in Jerusalem and a rural population in its small towns and villages throughout the countryside. Geographically occupying hill country, foothills and arid desert, Jerusalem and Judea was of little strategic importance, whereas the coastal plain that traversed the Levant from north to south and the Jezreel Valley that connected the coast to the east was always important for travellers. And so I'm going to change this map to a map now of Israel, which I have, so we can start explaining these terms. So here's the coastal plain up here. This is basically the region of Judea as it is at this point in time in history. And here's the Jezreel Valley, which was significant because they would come from the coast through the valley, across the Jordan River, and up on the other side up to what was formerly Mesopotamia. So this was a major corridor for trade and also for the movement of troops. And so each of these warring parties, what they were interested in was having this nice flat land and across here so they could move trade and troops wherever. So this region over here was not seen as anything of value to these warring parties. So the blessing of this nation and the location of the tribes of Judah from the past, God placed them in a place when all these conflicts which he spoke about would come and happen. The majority of the time, it didn't actually affect them. And so we see God's hand on this situation. Okay, so Ptolemy maintained a military presence to protect his economic and territorial interests. With no strategic value to the south, the pharaoh chose to invest in defences and infrastructure to the north of Jerusalem and along the coast to the west of Judea. So history tells us he heavily fortified Samaria, the capital city of Samaria, to the north of Jerusalem with strong walls. Here is Samaria. So this was fortified by Ptolemy. If you look at all of these yellow spots here, I'll come to them in a moment, but these are all of the coastal cities for which he was also very keen to control and fortify for his troops to come through there. So I'll explain this as we go. So we're going to have a quick look at Samaria and the Samaritans because this affects our understanding of the Bible. So Samaria had a large number of people who still call themselves Israelites at this point in time in history. And they worshipped the Lord on Mount Gerizim rather than Mount Zion. So here's Mount Gerizim, right next to Samaria. Here's Mount Ebal. What happened here? Does anyone remember? We're going to go back in time a fair bit. What happened with these two mountains? What's their significance?
The Baal prophets?
Sorry?
Was it the Baal prophets got killed there?
Not what I'm looking for. Right back to when...
Was it where the... when they were wandering the desert, wasn't it when they were trying to get them to curse from different areas of the mountains to curse the
Right,
Israelites?
you're roughly on there. So basically, 6 of the tribes were on one side at Mount Ebal, 6 of the tribes were on the other side of Mount Gerizim. When we have a look at the words that were given by Jacob to his 12 sons, we found that 6 of the tribes were cursed and 6 of the tribes were blessed. And so they actually ended up being assembled on either side. This is the place where they worshipped the Lord. and where they recited all of the laws, and where the land of inheritance was given to each of them, from which they left and then went throughout the land and occupied it. Okay, so all these events happened between here. So Samaria was made the capital a long time earlier than this, but now, because of the fortifications and the buildings that's probably there, he decides that he would make this strong point there for the Egyptians. Now, so of course, those from Mount Zion, or those from Judea, were called Jews, but they actually called the people from the north Samaritans, not Israelites. These Samaritans claimed they were Israelite descendants of the northern tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who had remained after the kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians. Now in the Bible, the name Samaritan appears for the first time in the second book of Kings, when it is used to describe people brought by Assyria to settle in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites they had taken away. So we find that in 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 29. So 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 29. So this is important. So in other words, history and the Bible tells us that the Assyrians brought people, they took the Israelites away, and they brought people back in. So they're not clearly Israelites, are they? So even though they brought their own gods, the main population, in other words those that remained, continued to worship the Lord, and the worship of foreign gods stopped. But despite this, the people of Samaria were never accepted by the Jews to their south. This is witnessed when we go to the book of Ezra, which wasn't that long ago we were looking at. When the exiles first returned to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem, what happened? The Samaritans offered to help, but they were rejected. So that's in Ezra 4 verses 1 to 6, because the Jews didn't accept that they were Israelites. So disgruntled by their rejection, when the Jews began to rebuild the city walls, the Samaritans complained to Persia's king Artaxerxes, who made them stop reconstruction until Nehemiah arrived in Ezra 4 verses 7 to 24. So all of that in Ezra chapter 4. When Nehemiah recommenced the construction of the walls, the Samaritans were openly hostile until they were finished, and that's found in Nehemiah chapter 6 verses 1 to 13. And so we have all of this history between the Jews and the Samaritans. Okay. Now when the temple was built, the Samaritans were forbidden to offer sacrifice at the temple. You may remember that. They said, can we come and offer? And the people said, no, you can't. So they were refused to offer sacrifices at the temple of Jerusalem or to intermarry with the Jews. This ongoing division between the Samaritans and the Jews led the Samaritans to build their own temple on Mount Gerizim near Shechem. And this is where we come back now to a little bit of recent teaching that we've had on King Alexander the Great, because when Alexander the Great swept through the region and defeated the Persians in Gaza, he first went to Jerusalem and the province of Judea to be welcomed by the Jews. So he offered a sacrifice at the temple and bestowed some privileges on them. When he was asked by the Samaritans to do honour to their temple also, he agreed. But when the Samaritans asked to be excused from paying tribute every 7th year, or taxes, as he had granted the Jews, he suspiciously asked who they were. They said they were Hebrews. That's what they said to Alexander. But they had Sidonian names and lived at Shechem. So he was even more suspicious. Asking them again, they actually replied that they were not Jews when they said it was, so he replied, I beg your pardon, it was to the Jews that I granted that privilege. So in other words, the Samaritans, when confronted by King Alexander the Great, said, no, we're not actually Jews. And so this leaves us in this difficulty, doesn't it? Because when we read the Bible, we find in the New Testament, in the time of Jesus, that there's some interaction with the Samaritans. One, of course, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay, so at this point in time, the hand of God was upon his people, because even though Pharaoh Ptolemy ruled over the Jews, neither Jerusalem nor the province of Judea was included in his advanced defences. So in other words, he went and took over Samaria. He could have gone to Jerusalem and taken over the fortified city, couldn't he? But he didn't. He went to Samaria instead. And so we see that the Jews continue to be protected and removed from the politics and history of the time. Now, the old coastal city of Acco that lay just north of Mount Carmel was made the new seat of the military governor of Kol Syria. And so this is it up here. Today it's called Acre, and it was formerly called Acco, but during this time its name was changed to Ptolemais. Rulers like to name places after themselves, just like Alexander the Great, who had numerous cities named after him. From there, Pharaoh Ptolemy built a road to travel east that passed the southern tip of the Sea of Galilee to go southeast through the arid desert to connect the King's Highway all the way south to the Red Sea port of Elat on the Gulf of Aqaba. So what that means is he built a highway that passes through this valley, here the Jezreel Valley, to connect to the King's Highway, which comes all the way down, right down to the Gulf of Aqaba, where Elat is at the bottom. So in other words, he was busy setting up trade routes and the ability to move troops around. From there, he built a road, I just said that. Now he encouraged economic and cultural growth, which is described as Hellenization. So you might have heard this word, Hellenization, along this route, a route that will become known as the Decapolis, which means 10 cities, which in Matthew chapter 4, verse 25, and Mark chapter 5, verse 20, I can give you these references after, and also in Mark chapter 7, verse 31, these are called the Decapolis, so the 10 cities. So marked on the map here, I have one city here, Sepphoris, Gadara, Scythopolis, which was formerly Beit Shean, Gerasa, and this one's called Philadelphia, funnily enough, which we take as an American city nowadays, but it's the former city of Rabath Ammon, the capital of the former Ammonites in the past. So here's the formation of those first 5 cities. They're 5 of 10 which are known as the Decapolis in the New Testament. So what we're seeing in this period of history is that all of the things that we come to recognise in the New Testament are now starting to occur at this point in time. So the Greeks had a large influence on what we read in the New Testament. Some of these cities were to serve as way stations or stopping points for caravans that travel between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean port of Ptolemais, Tyre and Sidon, and many Greek immigrants came to these places to join with the local Aramaic-speaking people to construct Greek theatres, gyms, music halls and libraries. So we see a big change in society. The coast south of Mount Carmel was also Hellenized. So when we say that word, it basically means it's infused with Greek culture when we talk about the Hellenic race. So was Hellenized with travellers and traders travelling all the way down to Egypt along the coast. The coastal cities, which are marked in yellow, which I mentioned earlier, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Jaffa and Dor, were all engaged in Hellenistic trade. And although the Philistinian and Phoenician people of these cities had managed to retain their own culture and beliefs, despite the presence of the Israelites and now the Jews, they now began to learn Greek, and like most people living in occupied territories, they became bilingual. And so we see these significant changes happening. So, almost finished. Despite the surging battles that had occurred between the successors, war and the rapid Hellenization of the region around them had little impact on Jerusalem and the province of Judea. So this is the point. Everything was changing around them, but this place still managed to remain the same. And this is because Ptolemy let local governance remain in the hands of the high priest of the Temple of Jerusalem, and here for the first time, and the Sanhedrin, a council of elders known in the Bible. When they spell it, they say Sanhedrion, so Synhedrion. We know this in our Bible as the Sanhedrin, Sanhedrin, and we find that in Matthew in chapter 26, verse 59, and also in Mark chapter 14, verse 55. Again, I can give you these references. Now, in some Bibles, the Sanhedrin's not called the Sanhedrin. They've changed the word to council, because that's what it is. It's a council of elders or wise people who are there to rule their people. And in fact, it's the council or the Sanhedrin who is occupied by the Pharisees, who are led by Caiaphas, who persecute Jesus. Okay, so this again is the first time that this word is being used. So many of the words we come across in the New Testament, they're occurring right now. So in other words, local governance remain in the hands of the high priest. So this is why I mentioned Caiaphas in the time of Jesus, a council of elders known in the Bible as Sanhedrin. So they had taken responsibility for their own people in the absence of their own governor. So in other words, there was no one governing them. There was no appointed governor. Why? Because one nation from the north was warring against another nation from the south. They were to and fro up the coast, but no one bothered to do anything with them. And so suddenly they had nobody over them. And so the high priest stood up, they formed a council in order to govern their own people. And this is the formation of the structure that we see in the New Testament. Prominent families were selected and made responsible for tax collection that they were required to forward to Egypt's capital and administrative centre in Alexandria. So, in other words, as long as they paid their taxes, they could sort of do what they liked at this point in time. Law and order was also maintained by the high priest, who administered the laws given by the Lord to Jesus. And so what do we see again? Once again, New Testament, Caiaphas, who was administering their laws? The high priest. And so we find this was all happening here, right on the cusp of 300 years before Jesus. So allowed to govern themselves and worship the God of Israel as long as they paid the taxes and posed no threat, the people of Judea were happy to cooperate with Pharaoh Ptolemy. Unlike other Hellenic kings, he lacked subjects from Greece, and he didn't trust the Egyptians whom he was ruling, so he wouldn't recruit them into his army. Being wealthy and able to pay well, though, he not only recruited thousands of young men from Judea to serve, but he understood that if he permitted them to worship the God of Israel in their own way, then they would remain loyal and willing to serve him. So once again in history, we have this extraordinary thing where God's people are treated differently to everybody else. It's amazing, isn't it? All the way through all the steps that we've covered, we find that there's special treatment for God's people. So these Jewish men not only immigrated to Egypt, but they also took their wives, children, and some Levites, and what were called Hazanim, which are musicians trained to lead worship and prayer. They took them with them, which created a bond of trust between the Pharaoh and the people of Judea. And so here we had Alexander the Great. He came in, they opened the gates to him. He said that they could practice their faith, right? He obviously allowed them to govern themselves, and he also allowed them not to pay taxes every 7th year according to the laws of God. And so here we find that now Ptolemy, one of the generals, has taken over the region, and what's he do? He's doing exactly the same again. And so we've moved through all of these years where the Jews haven't been in control of themselves since Babylonian exile, and what do we find? They're still allowed to practice their faith. Now, as the political and ecclesiastical centre of the province of Judea, Jerusalem had a population estimated at this time to be somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people, so it's very sizable. All other Judean cities were really only towns of a few thousand inhabitants at most, and small towns like Bethlehem, south of Jerusalem, were actually only villages populated by a few craftsmen and several dozen families that worked the land, tended vineyards and olive trees, and cared for poultry and livestock. And so this is historical information. And so history tells us that Akim, who's living at this point in time, the 6th generation forefather of Jesus, he was just a teenager aged 13 in 301 BC, but he had absolutely no influence over his life from Pharaoh Ptolemy, because he ignored the rural villages and saw them as places of little to no significance. And so we see this picture of what it's like to be living. So with no threat to his adolescent life, as the forefather of Jesus, the Messiah, we're going to return next week to the international stage where King Antagonius is going to die. his son Demetrius is going to be defeated, and reunification of the Macedonian Empire is going to be forever lost. And so that brings us to the end of tonight. A lot to take in as usual, because we're following history in order to find out what's going on. The main points to take away tonight is, of course, that whilst the former empire of King Alexander the Great separated, it ended up forming 4 kingdoms with kings, fulfilling the prophecy that Daniel gave. Right? It also fulfilled the prophecy that none of the descendants of King Alexander the Great would rule ever again. So we see God's word being fulfilled. So all of that history basically pertains to that. Of course, we've now got 4 new kingdoms all vying against one another, and so the story of history is about the moves and shifts against one another. But during all of this that was happening, and even though they're going up and down the coast as they're battling against one another, we find that the province of Judea and Jerusalem is left out of the picture. The capital city of Samaria, just to the north, was chosen by Ptolemy to be the place to rule as a capital city in this region. And so Jerusalem and this territory was completely left at peace. We find during this time of peace that there is now no longer anybody governing the province of Judea. And so the high priest steps up, and he becomes essentially the new governor, appointing a group of elders to actually manage the affairs of state. What they do have to do is pay taxes to Egypt, and we find here that Ptolemy was such a good ruler as far as they were concerned, that he paid so well that many of the men took their families down to Egypt and became part of the army. In terms of Akim, as a forefather of Jesus, he was a boy at this point in time in history, and we find that he's in a rural village which is very small and have no consequence to Ptolemy whatsoever. And so his upbringing, as that of his father, would have had absolutely no change whatsoever. We did learn last week, however, that when King Alexander the Great went through Judea, that he visited all of the small towns and villages. And so his father would have probably had stories about the time that King Alexander the Great and his entourage came through Bethlehem, but for Akim, no such great stories. And so because we don't have a biblical story for this point in time, we get to find out through history what was going on during the life of this particular descendant in the genealogy of Jesus. Okay, so thank you for joining us. So next week we will have a second lesson that follows the life of Akim, and then after that we actually move on to the next descendant, 5 generations before Jesus.